If you are training for performance or running to lose weight, then this is a video you have to watch. In this world which is so generated by social media and where our performances are in the spotlight and we're constantly pushing ourselves to really be the best that we can be, where we are running to try and lose weight and to look like the picture of health, we really have to be aware of the dangers presented by fueling ourselves and pushing ourselves into conditions of energy, low availability, and even worse, relative energy deficiency syndrome, which is really the end of the chain and what we are going to help you avoid in this video.
All right, so what is RED-S? Relative Energy Deficiency in Sport, or Relative Energy Deficiency Syndrome. It's kind of known as the two. And what does that mean? Essentially, RED-S is the umbrella term for a spectrum of disorders that will have an effect on your physiological systems and or your performance in your running. So on one end of the spectrum, we'll have what we know as low energy availability, and on the other end of the spectrum, essentially severe RED-S. Anywhere along that spectrum is going to have really, really detrimental effects on your physiological health. Things like your cardiovascular, your dietary, your gastrointestinal, there's growth concerns as well. When I say those things, I know that you guys very often turn off, so let's speak specifically to you as a runner. What does that mean? It means that if you are finding yourself somewhere along the spectrum, you might have performance decrements, you might lose some endurance, you might not be able to gain muscle strength, there's depletion of your glycogen stores, all of which are really, really important for running. You may feel like you are never able to recover enough, or constantly injured, or constantly sick. A lot of these things are symptoms of RED-S. We're going to dive into a lot more detail about this in this video as well.
I think one of the biggest problems when it comes to identifying low energy availability is really that some of the symptoms are actually similar to when we are just a bit tired from training, when we're a little bit irritable because we are tired from training. If we are withholding a little bit of calorie to combine the exercise with weight loss, there is going to be some irritability. So I think the important thing here is to recognize that there's probably 2 or 3 things that need to come together, and that will then tell you that actually you're starting to push yourself too deep into this thing. There's not enough energy to go around. So typically when I'm looking at someone and wondering, are they going into overtraining? Are they going into low energy availability? What are some of the warning signs that we look for? Okay, some fatigue is obviously normal. If you are training hard, pushing yourself hard, there are going to be periods where you feel a bit flat and where you feel a bit tired and a bit lethargic. However, that cannot be all the time. If you are in a proper training program that allows you to recover, you're not going to be tired and listless day after day and week after week. You're going to have very short-term periods of tiredness and lack of motivation and listlessness that last a maximum of a day or 2. The second and very big warning sign that's coupled with that tiredness is that if you are very tired, you will sleep and sleep well. So that's how we normally operate. If we overdo it in our normal lives, we compensate by sleeping longer than normal or deeper than normal, and you can feel that. So if that fatigue is coupled with an inability to sleep, so you're seriously tired, but when you go to bed at night, you can't sleep, that's a big warning sign that you are going into low energy availability. Thirdly, one of the responses from your body to that low energy availability or tiredness is that your body craves sugar, so your appetite is pushed up. If you are tired, you cannot sleep, and you have no appetite, that is a very loud warning signal that you have now moved into low energy availability, and simply resting and taking a few days off is not going to reset the clock and get you back. You have to then look at your nutritional intake and get yourself back into balance.
So under this umbrella of Red S, right, we have low energy availability and we have severe Red S. Lindsay's mentioned that around the low energy availability, but where did essentially this umbrella of Red S come from? Essentially from the beginning we had what was known as the female athlete triad, and that was the combination of disordered eating or eating disorders, changes in your bone health, and amenorrhea, which was essentially losing your menstrual cycle or no longer having your menstrual cycle. And the combination of those three is what was known as the female athlete triad. What happened over time is that the scientists realized that this doesn't only affect females, right? So the loss of your menstrual cycle is obviously specific to females, but this disorder doesn't only affect females, and many studies went into it, and that is how they decided on the spectrum. And that it wasn't just that, you know, you might have an athlete that is underfueling, who then has a couple of bone issues, who then loses their period. It might be a male athlete who has disordered eating, has a couple of bone injuries, loses performance, and so on. And so they decided along a spectrum as opposed to a female-specific triad only. Of course, that triad forms part of Red S at the moment, but it is just one aspect that is specific to females. But in terms of the umbrella of Red S, it affects males and females in all sports. So if we look at this one side, the low energy availability, what does that mean essentially? So what we are looking at, as a human being, you are required to have some sort of energy to just survive, to breathe in and out, for your heart to beat, for your brain to work. We call that our energy expenditure. We need a certain amount of energy every day just to survive. We then also are exercising, and so we have an exercise energy expenditure, and the balance of those two is vital so that we don't find ourselves in what we call low energy availability. One of the big findings with Red S, with this umbrella or the spectrum, as opposed to the triad in the beginning, is that they've defined disordered eating or eating disorders a lot more clearer. So we're no longer just talking about eating disorders, anorexia, bulimia, and so on. We're talking about, well, that is one side of it. Eating disorders is definitely one part of it, but there is also disordered eating. So there's two aspects here. And so very often, people often go, well, I'm not anorexic, I'm not bulimic, so this doesn't actually apply to me. But the disordered eating very often does. That can mean, disordered eating can mean skipping meals, fasting, only having one meal a day, using diuretics, overeating. Any of those sorts of aspects are disordered eating, all of which can play or have an effect on that balance of your energy expenditure and your exercise energy expenditure. And that is why this becomes such a key aspect of what we're doing when we are runners, and why Red S is such an important thing to pay attention to. What happens physiologically when we find ourselves in this low energy availability? For females, very often people will go, oh, well, you know, you have reduction in estrogen. In males are fine, some reduction in testosterone. I mean, neither of those are good things. But before any of that happens, there's actually very, very big changes that happen within your thyroid sort of function, within your bone health. And there's studies that have shown that disordered eating for only 5 days, so low energy availability for 5 days, can have a detrimental effect already on your thyroid function, which is essentially your release of testosterone and growth hormone, both of which are vital for exercise performance. It can have an effect on your bone health. It can have an effect then on testosterone and estrogen effects as well. And so just 5 days, and that is why this really, really becomes so important. They've done a number of studies on low energy availability, and in the past there was a variance of 5 to 55% of athletes who self-reported that they had disordered eating. That's massive, but very often that is because the way they did those studies, they often had coaches asking, and so people weren't really honest. More recently though, some of the studies are showing that in a group of females, Dr. Kate Ackerman and her group did this study where in their group of females, 47% of those females had some sign of disordered eating, and that it will definitely have an effect on their athletic performance in the long run.
Let's look at the things that are specific to females. Often the first sign of moving into relative energy deficiency syndrome, or REDS, is that we have this dropping in performance despite the fact that we are working harder, training harder, trying harder. Okay? So the first instinct when our performance is starting to go down is to try and fix what we're doing wrong by doing more of it. So the first warning sign is really if you are training what you consider to be really well, if you're training as well, if not better than people around you, but your performances are starting to climb. That will be the early sign. Picking up minor injuries that you don't normally deal with, typically those will be musculoskeletal or muscular at the beginning rather than skeletal. We will then move into the next phase, which is that kind of being a bit tired, being a bit listless, not sleeping well, dropping appetite. The next layer that moves in then is that often females will lose their period. They will get something called amenorrhea, where there's a disruption in their hormones which compromises the menstrual cycle. Now, in the past, particularly in elite athlete communities, this was worn as a badge of honor. Look at me, I'm training so hard and I am now light enough that I have lost my period, and that has got performance benefits because I weigh so little. And we now know that that is just so disruptive to your medium and long-term health and can compromise your performance. So if you get to the point where you have lost your period or disrupted your or irregular menstrual cycles, that is a very loud warning sign to you that you need to do something about your nutrition in combination with the training that you're doing. If you ignore that step, you're going to move into the final layer, which is that you will start to get repeated stress fractures. Stress fractures can occur from overdoing training, and they are not recurring. So once an athlete has dealt with that, move on and made a few corrections in their training, those stress fractures will not reoccur. When you start to get multiple stress fractures at multiple locations, that is a sign that you've been in reds long enough that you've compromised your bone mineral density and are setting yourself up for something called osteoporosis later in life, which is very, very difficult to reverse.
Right, Lindsay's looked at some of the red flags and warning signs for females. So let's look at what some of those red flags or warning signs are for males in particular. So first things first, changes in your performance or drops in performance. Very often it starts with perhaps a plateau in performance. That is one of the things that we need to pay attention to. Of course, it's not the only aspect. Combine that with an aspect of not feeling like you are recovering well enough after training, or that you're constantly ill. Those are all really, really key signs that perhaps something is not right here, and we really need to investigate that further. Those are your first warning signs to start with. And then as we're going further along into that, if this low energy availability doesn't get sorted out, you may eventually find yourself getting things like stress fractures, severely ill all the time, and really you would have the same effects as anorexia, and your drop in performance, your drop in physical health, all of those things would be affected at the top end of that, or the bad end of that red S spectrum.
Now that we've discussed the warning signs and what to look out for, how do you avoid going into low energy availability in the first place? It's really important that you always look at your training in conjunction with fueling as well as training load. As your training load changes, so does your fueling strategy need to change in relation to that training load. So we do want to set up healthy training cycles or training plans that take into account periods where we push harder, periods where we recover. In short-term microcycles of a week, we want to have some days where we push hard, some days where we go easy, some days where we recover, and we want our nutrition to speak to that training cycle, to assist with the recovery, to assist with replenishment, to make sure that you always have the energy available that you need for training purposes.
Once Red S has been diagnosed, and it requires a medical physician in order to be diagnosed, because as you've seen from this video, there are very many moving parts to this. But the treatments essentially would need to take place with a team, essentially. A physician in charge of that team, really diagnosing the issue at first, really seeing where the concerns are coming from, but really a multidisciplinary team. So a physician and a dietitian are key, because we would then be addressing that low energy availability side of things. And then of course, if you can have a coach and a psychologist or family members involved as support, all of that is really, really important. So the physician and the dietitian are absolutely key in order to treat this condition, but in order to really make changes and positive changes, we do need the buy-in of the entire team, including the coach and a support structure as well.
Now that you know how important training and nutrition are to achieving your goals, we've just seen so many mistakes that people make with their nutrition. So if you want to know the mistakes you don't even know you're making, watch this video now.